Part 2. The Time of the Second Regent and the Path to Renewal. In the absence of a Raig, the Gwicht ran rampant across Tirneach, causing terror amongst the people and forcing them to dedicate themselves to the defence of their communities and little else. Once the treachery of Maury the Brute was resolved, the Regent and the Earlas of the Realms issued a joint edict ordering all Galoglig to travel to a realm capital and remain there to ensure security and stability until a new Raig could be appointed. The first summer without a Raig had been a trial, and the second proved to be just as harrowing for the realms. Many, among the learned and the superstitious alike, proclaimed this an ill omen and a clear sign that a new Raig, any Raig, was needed immediately to bring peace and restore order. Others counselled patience, warning that no one should want to return to the chaos of 3 Raigs in fewer than 6 years, or, perhaps more importantly, the 6 years of draconian order under Regent Dorcan the Grim that followed it. In any case, Regent Tirgan was unmoved by calls for expedience, as he judged the would-be Raigs and weighed their support and aptitudes. The realm's capitals received reinforcements from the Galoglig, though not all of them as much as they would have liked or needed. Some openly criticised the Galoglig for allowing favouritism to come into play, with many thanes simply bringing their bands to protect their own home realms, foregoing others who might be in greater need of aid. Others simply marched to whichever capital was nearest when the call came, perhaps considering a lengthy journey across the turbulent realms a risk not worth taking. Some bands, which were between campaigns or taking rest when they received their order, ended up scattered across several realms, as their members took it upon themselves to decide where help was needed most. A few bands even experienced serious schisms over the issue of which capital deserved their aid. Many Galoglig took the time to have themselves formally transferred to another band, so that they could serve in the capital closest to their families and loved ones, but a handful simply took their own leave and joined up with bands known to not ask too many questions. Some folk who lived in isolated and rural parts of Tirneach fled their homes to seek shelter in the better defended cities and capitals, but for those who remained, there was one unusual source of support. Shortly after the call to defend the capitals, the Regent announced that it had been discovered that the late Raig's Galoglig band, the Golden Knives, had never formally been decommissioned after she took the crown, and that he recognised Aster Ua Larkspur as the standing thane of that band. It seemed a strange thing for the Regent to bother with amid all the turmoil, but shortly afterwards, open letters were received in many of the towns and villages around Tirneach. They claimed that Aster had been given authority over all Galoglig who had been separated from their bands and ordered them to join them to receive further orders. The letters also specified that any Galoglig travelling to meet Aster was to do all they could to ensure the safety of the roads and outlying settlements as they travelled. The orders did not specify Aster's location. Many initially took the orders to be a hoax, or perhaps some kind of trap, but the Regent did nothing to disavow Aster's claim to authority, and as the months went on, members of the Golden Knives began to be seen wandering the roads of Tirneach, always on their way to meet their thane, and always watchful for threats overlooked by the capitals, both supernatural and mundane. Although there were many tales of such wandering Galoglig coming to the aid of beleaguered travellers or remote farmsteads, there were just as many that speak of supposed Golden Knives turning to extortion and banditry. When Regent Tirgan put out the call for Galoglig to reinforce the capital city of Corach, enough heeded his summons to hold the Gwicht at bay. Bands of Galoglig coordinated the defence of Usa's roads and waterways, and, for the most part, held the Gwicht away from the city. Those who were tasked with keeping peace in the city witnessed something disturbing, however, as many of the fisherfolk who supplied Corach with a sizable portion of its sustenance began to act strangely. Fights would break out between friends who'd worked together amicably for decades, often turning violent. Others claimed they were being watched or followed, often accusing those closest to them of spying on them and trying to reveal their secrets, whether they had any secrets or not. Investigation revealed that all those afflicted had caught one of the strange one-eyed fish that had recently been sighted in the waters. On investigation, the creatures were revealed to be Gwicht, and their paranoia-inducing effects seemed to be temporary, so long as further contact with them was avoided. The presence of these strange, elusive Gwicht fish made the vital work of the fisherfolk a tense and unpleasant affair. However, the schemes of the Gwicht soon turned out to be the least of the Usig problems. While surviving members of the Riverborn and the Breaker heresy continued to make a nuisance of themselves, a new group soon eclipsed them. Calling themselves Lovan's Legacy, they claimed to be the champions of Vigil, and called on the regent to immediately anoint Irla ní Orfiche as Raig, appoint any backwater fish tickler as Irla of Usa, and move the crown realm to Vigil. Naturally, the regent disregarded their demands as irritating bluster. That was until the very next night, when the group arranged the murders of several Usig riders. A gold crown splattered with red dots was left painted on the walls at each of the murder scenes. Irla ní Orfiche fervently disavowed this group and their actions, and began a rigorous hunt for the perpetrators. Despite the assistance of Irla ní Orfiche in investigating the murders, the true identities of Lovan's Legacy remain unknown. While investigations into these killings were underway, Corach suffered its most concerted attack from the Gwicht for several days. Before these attacks, it had been reported that more and more of the unsettling one-eyed Gwicht fish were turning up in the waterways around Corach. The Galoglig who had been posted throughout the area were quickly alerted when the creatures began to gather in turbulent shoals and merge their bodies together, forming larger and larger monstrosities with more and more glassy staring eyes. Some of the amalgam fish creatures were destroyed by quick-reacting Galoglig, but most of them were able to swim towards the city as the warriors who were out on patrol rushed to keep up with them. On the outskirts of Corach, the creatures began once again to merge. Soon, a hulking, amorphous horror, covered in thousands of accusing eyes, dragged itself out of the waters, and began slouching towards the citadel of the Shaper. Several Galoglig and fisherfolk were crushed under its slimy bulk as it slid inexorably towards the citadel, destroying boats, bridges, nets and traps as it went. Word soon reached the defenders that Regent Tirgan was attending a meeting with the full prelate council in the citadel, not that they needed any additional incentive to protect the Shaper citadel from the awful Gwicht. At first, however, it seemed that nothing could deter the monster from its course. Under a hail of blows from the warriors assembled, it never slowed or changed its course, but lashed out all around with fins and tails that emerged and dissolved from its disgusting form. Galoglig whose skin came into contact with the ichor of the beasts were immediately affected by an intense and violent paranoia, turning upon their allies. Eventually, with the creature coming within an arrow shot of the citadel, several mages began to cast spells of fear over it. While the great beast initially resisted, eventually the effect took hold, causing the monster to erupt in ichor, as every individual Gwicht fish making it up tried to flee a different way. Armed with the secret of this victory, the Galoglig were able to drive the creature away from the citadel before it could reform into its full size. Badly wounded and kept from its prey, dozens of the smaller horrors dissolved back into the waters from whence they came. For the Usig of Corach, this was a time of anxiety for coming threats, and longing for a new Raig deserving of their loyalty. Sightings of the Gwicht fish became rare in the wake of the victory, but they have not disappeared entirely. Further, no trace of the perpetrators of the Lovan Legacy murders was found. Traditionally considered safe and secure, Bar attracted the concern of few Galoglig, and the Riders and Ruby families of Vigil concerned themselves primarily with the defence of historic Umra over the actual capital. Though Vigil has typically suffered less from the Gwicht threat than the other realms, this drastically changed in the absence of the Raig. Ridings such as Scatrion were cut off for months. Massive Gwicht formed from crumbling marble, and hosts of smaller creatures, reported to look like ghoulish scarecrows, accompanied common Gwicht monstrosities as they prowled the ridings of Vigil. The Galoglig and Bar found themselves spending most of the long season coordinating the meagre forces present to stretch as far as they could. Patrols through the farmlands worked desperately to keep the fields safe enough to be worked, as they were menaced not just by Gwicht, but by mortal bandits and looters, as well as vermin grown bold in the chaos. As the second summer began, the already severe Gwicht attacks spiked sharply, and the harried Galoglig were finally overwhelmed. A terrible Gwicht mockery of a massive tower burst without warning through Bar's city square as the sun reached its midday peak, and immediately began to crumble and collapse. Dozens of bystanders, including Erla ní Orfica and several riders, were caught in the torrent of debris. Fortunately, there were just enough Galoglig to manage the crowd and to fight off the smaller Gwicht that poured out of the broken tower. Drina of House Roaring Thunder was able to drag the Erla to safety, where she could be stabilised before she bled out. As the dust settled, the Galoglig heard a terrible sound in the distance and saw on the horizon that Umra itself had fared even worse. They looked on in horror as one of the 3-storied towers of the city, built by the Lazir during the old kingdom of Sheevil, was smashed to pieces and fell from view. The assembled Galoglig managed to save who they could among the Ruby families, though fires scorched many of the fields, and Baraha and other pests devoured others. The local riders and Galoglig on hand were able to organise and guard enough supply caravans to avoid the threat of famine in Sheevil. However, many merchants cancelled shipments to other realms or sharply raised their prices, citing shortages and increased demand. The increased prices led to their neighbours contemplating taking by force what they couldn't buy with coin. For the Chevalig of Bar, this was a time of loss and fear for what could come next, even as some saw opportunity in the crisis. Although the treachery of Maury the Brute was put to an end, the stability of the situation in Vale remained in doubt, and enough Galoglig mustered in Orcian to relieve the city's militia from the Gwicht onslaught. As the city became ever more crowded by those seeking shelter, the Galoglig in Orcian found themselves struggling to keep peace within the city, as much as they fought to keep its walls safe. Disputes between clans, between guilds, between Highlanders and Lowlanders, and between those who had fought for Irla Dallas and those who were suspected of still harbouring loyalty to Marie the Brute, threatened to tear the city apart from within. Particularly vigilant Galoglig, tasked with securing a meeting between the trade guilds and a number of Highland clans, unmasked Casey, head of the Friendly Hand Guild and a hero of the Battle of Scarlet Heather, as a Gwicht impostor. The Gwicht was cut down before it could escape, but not before it drew a twisted horn and blew a blast of sound that caused fear and nausea in all around it. This was the opening salvo in a terrible battle, as more Gwicht impostors revealed themselves and opened the gates to the city. Gwicht poured through the streets, and the ensuing battle was long and bloody, claiming many lives, including that of the real Casey and Detain, head of the Polished Smile Trade Guild. Tiernan mac Aengusa was almost counted among the dead, were he not spotted by Galoglig, lying face down in a side street, a poisoned blade stuck in his back. In the aftermath of the battle, the city was searched thoroughly for any more Gwicht impostors, but none were found. Still, suspicion remained, as did a sense of uncertainty over how long some people had been replaced for, and some embarrassment over how the leaders of the city had been manipulated. Mistrust and a paralysing caution slowed down the appointment of new guild heads, which in turn hampered trade and the supply of vital goods across the lowlands and other realms. The Highlands had their own tragedy to contend with, as the heirs of every courtly clan, except for the wandering heir of Clan Mactira, received signs and visions of a translucent amber castle in a rocky field, ringing with the sounds of laughter, song and battle. They became certain that these visions would lead them to the site of the Amber Hall, the site of the tragic former rulers of Vale, damned before the coming of the Rake, where they would find long-lost power that could defend Vale from the Gwicht. Even the scions of long rival clans worked together to decipher the visions and reveal the location hidden within. The elders counselled patience, to allow their scholars and those visiting from among the Galoglig to study their account, and for Galoglig to be sent in arms to scout the area first. However, full of headstrong ideas of destiny, many of the heirs ignored this advice and snuck away together to follow their visions and bring salvation to Vale. When Galoglig's scouts were sent after them, they found only undead waiting to greet them. The grim abominations were all that was left of the heirs of the courtly clans. For the Baillig of Urkian, this was a time of loss and suspicion. With the recent incursion of the blazing host near Ardbaloch still fresh in public memory, many Galoglig answered Irla Marblespine's call to reinforce Crag Uskion, capital of Driad. Galoglig patrolled any tunnels that led to the surface, guarding the Arcane College and the Shrine of the Shaper, and kept peace between spirited scholars. Though some few Gwicht managed to find their way down below, they were soon caught by the patrols and dispatched. The real trouble in Crag Uskion came from a more terrestrial threat. News about excess water in a few tunnels surrounding the Arcane College caused immediate alarm among the Druidig. However, before anything could be done, the trickles became torrents, and tunnels began to flood. Caught in the midst of an orderly evacuation, the calm environs occupied by the experienced Druidig tunnel dwellers began to ring with screams. Tunnels once blocked off by the collapse, or by intention, had been opened by the rushing waters, releasing undead thought safely contained within them into Crag Uskion, including hordes of Slua from the recent siege in Ardbaloch. The Galoglig leapt into action, guarding the evacuees and pinning down the abominations to allow them to escape, before supporting the engineering effort to pump water clear from the tunnels. Once the area was traversable once more, they were the first to enter and clear any remaining dangers. In the aftermath, evidence of sabotage was discovered, and blame was laid at the foot of a gang of broken chains, attempting to destroy the Arcane College as a revenge for being rejected. The Arcane College was relocated to several smaller off-site facilities during the months it took to clean and repair the affected areas. Some particularly observant Galoglig noticed that the flood had weakened supports of the tunnels above, and raised concerns of sinkholes opening that could allow the Gwicht to swarm en masse from the surface to the Shrine of the Shaper. Many Galoglig were dispatched to the surface to rid the area of the remnants of the blazing host, as well as several roaming gangs of Knockan Brisha, Macari, and a strange type of Gwicht who shone with a blinding light. Others helped with the repair of the tunnels below and kept ever more careful guard to prevent further acts of sabotage. For the Druidig of Crag Uskion, this was a time of vigilance and suspicion. Tirneach, the capital of Bruid, is an important trade hub and the most northerly town in Bruid. However, nowhere in Bruid is far enough away from the Great Forest to be entirely safe. Enough Galoglig heeded Irla Shunnock's call for aid to prevent the Gwicht and the Great Forest from overtaking the settlement. Nonetheless, the Galoglig had their work cut out for them, as more Knockan Brisha than had ever before been seen lumbered out of the forest, with immense tree-trunk clubs and battering rams, seeking to smash down the city walls. Meanwhile, mobs of Wenigadi crept through the streets, looking to feast on unguarded supplies. Gwicht were far from the only trouble besetting the settlement, as the fierce beasts of the forest, forced out by the disturbances, as well as the unsettled dead, also had to be repelled. The nights inside the city were not much more peaceful, as Galoglig had to mediate disputes between the comfortable wool merchants of Tirneach and the more rugged Bruidig of the forest, who had come to seek shelter within the city walls. With great effort and the assistance of new arrivals from Schlachtfeld, on a pilgrimage to find challenges to prove their worth, they managed to avoid needless casualties arising from these disputes, or from the many threats that surrounded the city. One misty moonless night, a horde of undead crawled out of the river and laid siege to the infirmary tents which had become a necessity in the city. Erla Shunnock himself was the first to notice the approach of the awful creatures and raised the alarm. For several minutes, the Erla, his personal guard, Abig of House Roaring Thunder, and a few of the wounded strong enough to hold spears were all that stood between the abominations and a slaughter of the infirmary camp. Thankfully, it didn't take long for the Galoglig, strengthened by the moonlight vigil, to arrive and lay waste to the foe and prevent the massacre. It was hard and constant work to keep Tirneach safe, and while they took solace in the faces of those they'd kept safe within the city, the Galoglig, looking beyond the city's walls, found a much more dispiriting sight. The strange, inexorable trees of the great forest spread out northwards, week by week, until soon the border of the forest was scarcely south of the city itself. Many settlements were completely cut off within the sprawl, their fate entirely unknown, and those who were able to reach Tirneach brought word of a terrible creature, a new and powerful Gwicht with a wide and grinning maw that consumed all that it destroyed and left no remains behind. For the Brúdig of Tirneach, this was a time of courage in the face of fear. Uncertainty cannot go on forever, and the time of darkness and despair slowly began to draw to a close. The people of Tirneach began to lose their patience for Regent Tyrgan's caution. As the third summer without a Raig approached, the devastating attacks of the previous year loomed large in people's memories, and demands for Tyrgan to recognise a candidate reached a fraught peak. Many folk began to claim that the tradition of House Roaring Thunder anointing the Raig was ceremonial only, and pressure built on the would-be Raigs to simply seize the throne and end the turmoil. Regent Tyrgan was seemingly unmoved by the threat of civil unrest, much to the alarm of his advisors. Pretenders to the throne were weighed and winnowed, many disregarded without serious thought. Some carefully given reason to leave the capital, and a few others receiving persuasive visits from warriors loyal to the regent. The weeping Fahak MacLeod failed to gain many supporters outside of the See of Druid. Finally, Tyrgan's bodyguards were able to breathe a sigh of relief as the regent announced he would recognise the winner of a duel between Iarla Eltna ní Orfacha and Rider Tiernan mac Aingasa as Raig of Tirneach. There was great excitement as preparations for the duel took place, and many risked the dangerous journeys from outlying ridings to come and bear witness to it. The morning of the duel was rife with rumour and suspicion. It was whispered there had been dramatic events the night before, and that the prelates of the councillors and the teachers had been summoned to Iarla ní Orfacha's quarters in the dead of night. As the appointed time for the duel arrived, the Iarla was nowhere to be seen, and the assembled crowd began to argue whether or not victory by default would be enough to win Tiernan the throne. A few long minutes passed before Eltna ní Orfacha strode onto the field, resplendent in brightly polished gold armour, a worn and well-cared-for sword by her side. Seeming not even to notice the crowd, the Earl walked straight to Tiernan mac Aingasa and knelt before him. Uproar seized those gathered, and even Tiernan was visibly startled by the gesture. Eltna revealed that she had received a vision from the Shaper the night before, and that she believed it was the Shaper's will that Tiernan serve as Raig and return Tirneach to safety and prosperity. Tiernan mac Aingasa was crowned as Raig that very day. As the new Raig was confirmed, Tain O'Callig, leader of the band Cuach na Raig, formally announced his retirement from the Galoglig to take a well-earned rest, running a small farm east of Urchiol. He was not alone, as more than a few Galoglig were exhausted from the 2 years of constant vigilance and chose to leave service. Others, having been in one place for such a long time, decided to put the travelling life of a Galoglig behind them and settle down. The promise of adventure, glory and wealth was enough to keep many more still serving, and to tempt new recruits who had seen and benefited from the Galoglig's presence during the seasons of uncertainty. Raig Tiernan took early action to mobilise the Galoglig bands to provide aid across the realms where it was most sorely needed. As part of this effort, he decreed that the band Cuach na Raig was to reunite under Thane Ulgarg Corcra, a Drake-blooded torchbearer who had been the Kinneret-Arms of White Eye's band. The decree went out that any members of the band that still upheld the oaths were to return to Corach, to take part in the reconsecration of the band, mustering under their new Thane before travelling on to Shivil. As the band began to reform, it was a golden opportunity for new recruits, eager to prove themselves, to join the band as well.